The War for the Inheritance of Rome. A History of Europe, Empire, and the Hidden Continuity of the Roman World. What if the great political struggles of European history were not merely a succession of wars between individual kingdoms, but part of a much older contest over who would inherit the legacy of Rome? Traditional history gives us a familiar sequence. Rome rises, Christianity spreads, the Western Roman Empire collapses, medieval kingdoms emerge, Spain discovers and conquers much of the Americas, the Dutch become a commercial power, England defeats Spain at sea, and eventually Britain and later the United States become dominant global powers. But there is another way of looking at this history. Perhaps Rome never truly disappeared. Perhaps its political institutions, religious traditions, architecture, symbols, laws, and ideas continued moving through Europe, being adopted by different peoples and repeatedly transformed. Perhaps what appears to be a series of unrelated historical developments was actually a long competition between different civilizations and elite networks over the inheritance of the Roman world. This is not an argument that a secret organization has been proven to control European history. The evidence does not establish such a conclusion. Instead, it is a thought experiment. What if we follow the connections and coincidences and ask where they lead? Rome did not simply die. The year 476 is traditionally presented as the end of the Western Roman Empire. But Roman civilization did not disappear. Latin survived. Roman law survived. Roman roads survived. Roman cities survived. Christianity survived. The Catholic Church inherited elements of Roman administration and organization. The Roman imperial concept survived as an ideal. And in the East, the Roman Empire continued to exist for another 1,000 years. The people we call the Byzantines called themselves Romans. Constantinople became the center of a civilization that combined Roman government, Greek culture, and Christian theology. The Roman world had therefore not vanished, its center had moved. This creates a fascinating historical question. If Rome continued in the East, what happened to the peoples living beyond the old Roman frontier in the north and west? The answer is one of the great transformations of European history. The peoples once called barbarians gradually became the rulers of Europe. Franks became French. Germanic kingdoms became the foundations of Germany and Austria. Anglo-Saxons became the English. Norse peoples became important players in Scandinavia and beyond. And eventually these supposedly barbarian societies developed kingdoms, universities, churches, legal systems, commercial cities, and imperial ambitions of their own. They did not simply reject Rome. They absorbed it. The barbarians became Roman Christian Europeans. Who would inherit Rome? This may be the central question. Rome had left behind an enormous cultural inheritance, but there was no single successor. The Byzantine emperors claimed to be Roman emperors. The popes claimed universal spiritual authority over Western Christendom. The Holy Roman emperors claimed an imperial inheritance. The French kings adopted Roman symbolism. The Spanish monarchs presented themselves as defenders of Catholic Christianity. The Habsburgs eventually became perhaps the greatest dynastic power in Europe. Everyone seemed to want some part of Rome. Perhaps European history can therefore be understood partly as a struggle over who had the right to define civilization itself. And that struggle eventually moved beyond religion and into economics, politics, and geography. Who would inherit Rome? This may be the central question. Rome had left behind an enormous cultural inheritance, but there was no single successor. The Byzantine emperors claimed to be Roman emperors. The popes claimed universal spiritual authority over Western Christendom. The Holy Roman emperors claimed an imperial inheritance. The French kings adopted Roman symbolism. The Spanish monarchs presented themselves as defenders of Catholic Christianity. The Habsburgs eventually became perhaps the greatest dynastic power in Europe. Everyone seemed to want some part of Rome. Perhaps European history can therefore be understood partly as a struggle over who had the right to define civilization itself. And that struggle eventually moved beyond religion and into economics, politics, and geography. The North awakens. For centuries, the Mediterranean remained the center of European civilization. Rome, Constantinople, Venice, Genoa, and the great cities of the Mediterranean dominated commerce and culture. But Northern Europe was developing its own centers of power. The North Sea and Baltic became enormous commercial highways. Cities in Flanders, the Netherlands, northern Germany, and England became increasingly wealthy. This northern world had different geographical advantages and increasingly different political traditions. The result was not necessarily a rejection of Rome, but a reinterpretation of it. Instead of one universal Mediterranean empire, Northern Europe developed competing kingdoms, cities, merchant organizations, and eventually republics. Then came the Reformation. The Reformation changes the political map. The Protestant Reformation is usually presented as a religious dispute. But religion and politics were inseparable. When Northern European rulers challenged the authority of Rome, they were also challenging the political structures associated with Catholic Europe. The conflict eventually divided Europe into competing spheres. Spain and the Habsburgs represented one side of the European order, Catholic, dynastic, and imperial. The Dutch Republic, England, and much of Northern Europe increasingly developed another, Protestant, commercially oriented and politically decentralized. This distinction should not be exaggerated. Protestant countries had monarchies, Catholic countries had merchants, and every European society contained competing institutions. But as a broad historical pattern, the divergence is remarkable. And nowhere was that divergence more important than in the Netherlands. Spain's Netherlands. The Spanish Netherlands may be one of the most important pieces of the entire puzzle. The region was wealthy, urbanized, and commercially sophisticated. Antwerp became one of Europe's great centers of international trade and finance. Yet it was part of the Habsburg system. Here we find a remarkable contradiction. Spain possessed an enormous empire, but one of its most economically sophisticated territories increasingly resisted Spanish political and religious authority. The Dutch revolt transformed that conflict into a struggle for independence. The northern provinces eventually became the Dutch Republic. The southern Netherlands remained under Habsburg rule. And something extraordinary happened. Economic and commercial power increasingly shifted toward Amsterdam. It was almost as if the economic center of gravity moved northward. Antwerp represented one world. Amsterdam represented another. One remained connected to the Habsburg and Catholic order. The other became the center of a Protestant commercial republic. Spain had silver. The Dutch had a system. Spain's American empire produced enormous quantities of silver. Potosi and other mines supplied the Spanish monarchy with resources on a scale Europe had rarely seen. But wealth is not the same thing as financial power. Spain was fighting wars across an enormous geographical area. Its armies fought in Italy, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Its fleets operated in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Its monarchy had to maintain garrisons, fortifications, diplomatic networks, and overseas colonies. American silver could finance those commitments, but the system also created enormous borrowing requirements. The Dutch were developing something different. Amsterdam became a center of finance, shipping, insurance, and international commerce. Dutch merchants created enormous joint stock enterprises such as the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch were not simply accumulating territory. They were building a commercial network. This distinction may be one of the keys to understanding the transition from Spanish to Northern European dominance. Spain built an empire. The Dutch increasingly built a global economic system. The Caribbean becomes the new battlefield. The struggle did not remain in Europe. Dutch merchants and privateers entered the Atlantic and Caribbean, challenging Spanish and Portuguese commercial dominance. Curaçao eventually became an important Dutch Caribbean center. The Caribbean therefore became part of a much larger struggle. Spain had pioneered the transatlantic imperial system. The Dutch increasingly learned how to exploit it. This produces an extraordinary historical sequence. Spain and Portugal open the Atlantic world. The Dutch enter that world and commercialize it. England adopts and expands many of the same methods. Eventually, Britain becomes the dominant maritime empire. Perhaps the successor did not destroy the original system. Perhaps it learned how to operate it more efficiently. England and the Dutch. This brings us to one of the most interesting relationships in European history. England and the Netherlands were separated by only the North Sea. They shared commercial interests. They increasingly shared Protestant religious affiliations. They both opposed Spanish and later French dominance. Their merchants interacted constantly. Dutch financial practices influenced England. Dutch military and naval experience influenced England. Then, in 1688, William of Orange became King of England. The Dutch and English political worlds became intimately connected. This may be one of the most important transitions in the story. The rise of Britain did not occur in isolation. It emerged partly from an Anglo-Dutch world. The Dutch had developed sophisticated commercial and financial institutions. England possessed enormous geographic and demographic advantages. The two systems increasingly reinforced one another. And eventually Britain inherited much of the Dutch commercial world while adding something of its own. A powerful navy, a growing financial state, and an enormous Atlantic empire. Was this a Northern European revolution? Here the speculative theory becomes interesting. Perhaps what occurred between the 16th and 18th centuries was more than a sequence of religious wars. Perhaps Europe was experiencing a long transition between two models of civilization. One model emphasized imperial authority, dynastic monarchy, Catholic universalism, aristocracy, Roman law, centralized legitimacy, Mediterranean civilization. The other increasingly emphasized merchant power, commercial finance, national sovereignty, Protestantism, parliamentary institutions, naval power, private enterprise. Spain and the Habsburgs became associated with the first model. The Dutch Republic and eventually Britain became associated with the second. Neither model existed in pure form. But the contrast is striking. And then there is America. The American colonies provide perhaps the most fascinating endpoint to this transformation. The colonists inherited European traditions. They inherited English common law. They inherited Christianity. They inherited Protestant ideas. They inherited classical education. They inherited Roman political vocabulary. But they also inherited Dutch commercial influences and the political experience of living far from centralized European authority. Then they created something unusual. A republic that consciously borrowed from Greece and Rome while rejecting European monarchy. The American capital resembles a classical temple. The Senate deliberately invokes Rome. The eagle becomes a national symbol. The language of republican virtue dominates the political culture. Washington becomes a symbolic figure comparable to Cincinnatus. And standing in the American Capitol is an enormous Egyptian-style obelisk. The American experiment therefore appears almost paradoxical. A new republic looking backward to the ancient world for its symbols while simultaneously attempting to create a political system unlike Europe's monarchies. Perhaps America was not rejecting European civilization. Perhaps it was attempting to inherit Rome without becoming Rome. The mystery of the symbols. This brings us to the more speculative portion of the theory. Why do ancient symbols continue appearing in European and American institutions? Why the obelisk? Why the pyramid? Why columns? Why Roman eagles? Why Greek temples? Why the sun? Why the stars? Why the recurring fascination with Egypt? The conventional explanation is powerful enough. Renaissance Europe rediscovered classical antiquity. Enlightenment thinkers became fascinated with ancient civilizations, and later political movements borrowed classical imagery because Greece and Rome represented reason, republicanism, and civilization. But there is another question. Why did these symbols remain so powerful for so long? The obelisk is particularly interesting. Ancient Egyptians associated obelisks with solar and royal symbolism. Romans transported Egyptian obelisks to Rome. Christian Rome later incorporated those obelisks into the urban landscape. The Renaissance revived interest in ancient Egypt and classical civilization. Freemasonry eventually developed elaborate architectural and Egyptian symbolism. And modern governments continued using the imagery. The Washington Monument is perhaps the most obvious example. Is this merely cultural inheritance? Almost certainly much of it is. But could there also be deeper intellectual traditions being transmitted through elite institutions? That remains a fascinating question. Mithras, the sun and the morning star. The ancient Roman world was filled with solar symbolism. Egypt had Ra. Rome had Sol Invictus. Mithraic traditions contained strong associations with the sun. The planet Venus appeared as the morning star. The Latin word Lucifer originally meant light bearer, or morning star. Later Christian theology associated Lucifer with Satan. These developments occurred across centuries and through very different religious traditions. There is no need to claim that all of these religions were secretly the same religion. But the recurrence of light, sun, stars, astronomical cycles, and divine knowledge is striking. Perhaps humanity repeatedly returned to these symbols because the sun is the most obvious representation of power and illumination. Or perhaps ancient religious symbolism preserved ideas that later civilizations repeatedly rediscovered. Again, the evidence leaves room for interpretation. Freemasonry and the ancient world. Freemasonry presents another intriguing puzzle. Modern organized Freemasonry developed centuries after the Roman Empire, so it would be historically inaccurate to claim that modern Masonic organizations are simply surviving Roman mystery cults. But Freemasonry deliberately embraced architectural symbolism. Columns, temples, geometric forms, the tools of the stonemason, Solomonic imagery, classical architecture, biblical symbolism, and eventually Egyptian motifs. Why? One explanation is that Enlightenment-era Europeans were fascinated with antiquity and used ancient architecture as a language for wisdom, order, and civilization. Another possibility is that fraternal organizations served as repositories for older symbolic traditions, not necessarily through an unbroken secret organization, but through the repeated rediscovery and reinterpretation of ancient ideas. That distinction is important. The mystery may not be a secret organization surviving for 2,000 years. The mystery may simply be why certain ideas and symbols keep returning. The hidden network hypothesis. This is where we can introduce the most speculative possibility. European aristocrats, merchants, intellectuals, and political leaders were never confined to national borders. They married across countries. They attended the same universities. They served foreign monarchs. They joined military orders. They participated in diplomatic networks. They traded with one another. They financed one another. They exchanged letters. They patronized artists and architects. And eventually they formed increasingly sophisticated societies and organizations. Perhaps political power therefore existed on two levels. The visible level. Kings, parliaments, wars, treaties, empires, colonies, and beneath it, families, bankers, merchant networks, aristocratic alliances, intellectual circles, fraternal organizations, religious institutions. Could these networks have influenced the direction of European history in ways that are difficult to see from conventional national histories? Certainly. Did they secretly coordinate the entire transformation of Europe? There is no evidence sufficient to establish that. But the existence of powerful transnational networks is not speculation. The question is how much influence they actually possessed. The Great Transition. Viewed from this perspective, European history begins to look like a gigantic transfer of power. Rome, Byzantium, Christian Europe, Holy Roman Empire, Habsburg Europe, Spanish Global Empire, Dutch Commercial Republic, Anglo-Dutch System, British Empire, American Republic and Global System. The institutions changed. The religions changed. The economic systems changed. The political systems changed. But the symbols, ideas, and cultural memories repeatedly returned. Perhaps that is simply what civilization does. It forgets. It rediscovers. It adapts. It reinvents. Or perhaps something deeper was being carried forward through Europe's elite networks. The question remains. The strongest version of this theory does not claim to have solved the mystery. Instead, it asks the question: was the rise of Northern Europe simply the consequence of geography, technology, religious reform, capitalism, and political evolution? Or was there also a deeper cultural struggle over who would inherit the civilization of Rome? Did the Protestant Reformation merely divide Christianity? Or did it also accelerate the political independence of Northern Europe from the old Mediterranean-centered order? Did the Dutch Revolt merely create an independent country? Or did it mark the transfer of Europe's commercial center of gravity from the Habsburg world toward the North Sea? Did England defeat Spain and simply replace it? Or did England inherit and transform a Dutch commercial system that had itself emerged from the collapse of Spanish dominance in the Netherlands? And when the American colonies created a republic filled with Roman, Greek, and Egyptian symbolism, were they merely borrowing the aesthetic language of classical civilization? Or were they participating in the same much older European argument? Who gets to inherit Rome? Perhaps there was never a single secret society directing the process. Perhaps there didn't need to be. Perhaps the real secret was the transmission of ideas itself, through families, churches, universities, merchants, soldiers, architects, financiers, and intellectual societies. The Roman Empire may have disappeared as a political entity, but its architecture remained. Its law remained. Its language remained. Its religion transformed it. Its symbols survived. And its idea of civilization continued to inspire those who came after it. Maybe the most remarkable thing about Rome isn't that it lasted for centuries. Maybe it is that people have been trying to inherit it ever since it ended. And perhaps the great geopolitical story of the last 2,000 years is not the disappearance of Rome at all. It is the story of everyone who came afterward trying to decide what Rome was, and who had the right to become its successor.
Mr. Lee, is this you talking or the...